Boricua time, a couple minutes late, and people, that people can come in. So this panel is the Aftershocks of Disaster panel, Puerto Rico before and after the storm. Everyone who is presenting on the panel today are contributors in this book that Marisol, LeBrón, and myself have co-edited. The book is on sale in the book area. It's normally $17. It's $10 today just for you. So please buy one for yourself, for your family members. We don't want to take it back home. And so what we're going to do in the panel today, Marisol and I will start by just saying a few words about how the book came to be and what we want it to be and the kind of conversation that we wanted to open up. And then each of our contributors will just say a little bit about what their contribution was and any thoughts that they have since the publication of the book. And so we should say that this book emerged out of a conference held at Rutgers University exactly 1 year ago for the first anniversary of Hurricane Maria. And I organized this conference. I was asked to do so by the vice president at Rutgers University, who wanted to, think about how to commemorate or in some ways, take stock of what had happened in Puerto Rico 1 year out. And I settled on this concept of aftershock for thinking about what was going on in Puerto Rico, even though the term aftershock is more often used to think about earthquakes than hurricanes. I wanted to think about how natural disasters and also economic disasters, political disasters, social disasters, they're not really contained in time, but they're actually, it's hard to say when they begin and when they end. And part of what, I was struggling in that first anniversary was to think about how to take stock of something that was still unfolding, that we were still feeling the repetitive shocks of Maria. And to also think about whether Maria was itself the main event that kept reverberating, or if Maria was a product of an earlier shock that Puerto Ricans had experienced, and if they were, the stage was already set for Maria to become a disaster, given everything that had happened with the economic crisis, Puerto Rico's long-standing political crisis, and its longer history of colonialism. So the book, it takes Maria as a starting point for thinking about everything that led up to Maria and to think about what would be the challenges moving forward from there. Marisol, do you want to say a little bit?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for being here today. I'm really excited to share the work with you and to hear from our amazing contributors. But one of the things that's really important, in addition to trying to highlight the cumulative effects, right, of Hurricane Maria, trying to think about it not just as this one-time event, but as something that both emerges from this longer history, but something that will also carry a much longer history for Puerto Ricans and for Puerto Rico. One of the things that we wanted to make sure we did in putting this collection together was really try to bring together a whole lot of different voices, right? So we didn't want this to just be a straight up scholarly text. We wanted this to have artists, activists, scholars, journalists. So if you look at the book, you'll see that the book starts off with a play, the play Ay Maria, which was performed in the aftermath of the storm in every town, right? Or every municipalities. Yeah, so as a way for the actors themselves also to try and make sense of what they had just experienced, we also have poets, various kind of contributions. So it was really important for us not to just think about the arts as a kind of icing on top of telling the story about Hurricane Maria, but to really think about it as central for trying to make sense of something which many of our contributors actually talk about as unnameable, right, or very difficult to narrate in just simple words, right? And so that's something that we tried to capture with this, and so even the pieces that are more journalistic or more scholarly also break with some of those traditional conventions too. It's just something that we're really proud of and really excited about to share with you all.
So I'm thinking as an order, Natasha, if you don't mind starting out with your piece about the debt, talking a little bit about that and how can we think about that piece, 2 years out. Then I'm thinking maybe Rima, if you could talk about the issues with the university, austerity, the cuts that you talk about in your book, and then Sarah, if you don't mind, then bringing us to the issues with FEMA and recovery that are so prescient right now.
All right. So, saludo. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
I should introduce Natasha. The bios are in the program.
No one told me, I know. And I put a picture that on my chest, so we came, we're like in familia with our t-shirts and the people here. So I want to first thank you both for the opportunity to be part of a great collaborative effort. And I feel like the book, so which I haven't even, the first time I see it, is really kind of the combination of so much of like this is nation building work right here. Mm-hmm. And the culmination of that, and nation in the large sense of the word nation, which includes obviously all 9 million Puerto Ricans, that are thinking about what does it mean to show up and to defend the right of existence of this nation. The piece that I got to write about, I'm a lawyer, I'm a human rights lawyer, so I got to write about an argument around the odious debt nature, the odiousness of the debt. So the debt we know now 4 years ago was declared unpayable by the former governor, Bonilla, which really set off a number of actions, including numerous attempts to try to renegotiate the debt. And then we get Promesa out of that, and we get the Federal Fiscal Control Board out of that. And at all points in that process, the debt was presumed to be legitimate. We know now, and that there's been demands for an auditing of the debt. We know that half of the debt has been declared most likely illegal, unlawful. But beyond that, when we think about, well, in law, there's what we call principles of equity and law. So there's no legal remedy here. The same way that we're never going to be able to litigate ourselves out of colonialism, we're never going to be able to go to a courtroom and talk about the colonial status. We know that the way that the legal system in the U.S. and the colonizing nation is set up is done in a way that really will always protect the economic and political interests of the nation. So when we think about what's happening precisely around litigation of the debt downtown here or in San Juan, it really is structured in a way that will always protect investors or creditors, which are, I think, intended to be really passive names to describe something that's wholly aggressive, that's deceitful, that's harmful, that's criminal. So when, as a lawyer, we look at, well, how do we think about what a different kind of outcome would be? And then the notion of odious debt comes to us from a different context, a context of transitional justice, where countries that have been led by dictatorships or oppressive regimes have borrowed, typically from either like the World Bank or IMF or even other nations, at the expense of their own people. So they borrow while they're oppressing their people. They borrow because they're engaged in lavish expenditures for their own security, for their own pockets, whatever it is. And while that may be a legal transaction, equitable principles say, well, we don't want to encourage those types of results, right? Because literally the people are paying for their own oppression. They're now being forced to repay a debt that was odious, that was intended to maintain their submission. And ironically, the first case where this was really brought up in an international context was when the United States called Spain's debt over Cuba and Puerto Rico odious and refused to pay after the Spanish-American War, and said that Spain indebted primarily Cuba to maintain their colonial rule, and that they, as the new colonizing nation, shouldn't have to be responsible for assuming Spain's odious debt, that it should be declared illegitimate. While we're obviously not transitioning from one dictatorship to another, though perhaps, especially after el verano del 2019, hashtag renuncia, hashtag Wanda renuncia, hashtag renuncia, que se vayan todos acá. You know, the colonial nature of Puerto Rico's kind of political status really lends itself to the same kind of argument of odiousness. Odiousness is saying, is looking at a couple of things. One, did the people benefit from being indebted, right? Was there some benefit that they accrued that would justify repayment? And we know that not only was there no benefit, that even though Puerto Rico was borrowing to theoretically supplement its public budget, that was the same time that massive public cuts were happening, right? And you think about, particularly under the Fortunio regime, right, how tens of thousands of public sector workers were laid off, how they were, you know, we think of what the junta is doing now, the control board is doing now in terms of an austerity regime that's being implemented, but really, it's been a decade of deep cuts to essential public services, to healthcare, to education, to infrastructure, to energy, to social services. All of those public benefits began at a time when the country was most borrowing. So when we're thinking about, well, really, was there a benefit to the public? Should they be forced to bear the cost, the literal cost of repaying that? And there's a clear no. The other aspect of odious debt says, well, did the investor, creditor, know that this was a financially risky transaction that they were engaging in, right? And that's also really clear. There's a reason why we call them vulture funds, because they're circling distressed debt. They're circling something that's dying. And we know that because not only were they buying bonds for 10 cents for, you know, what was valued to be $1, but then they were charging 25% interest because of how risky it was. The same way that if you have bad credit and try to go, you know, pay for a car, they're going to charge you some insane risk, some insane interest fee because of the risk that you present. So there was clearly, and this was after Puerto Rico's credit was downgraded to basically junk bond status, there's clearly knowledge about what they were engaging in, and were trying to exploit as a result. And, you know, neo-colonial relationships are really centered around these exploitative economic indebted deals, right? Even though Puerto Rico is an explicit colonial, has a colonial relationship, this neo-colonial context also is about economic control, a permanent economic control over that nation's production, importation, exportation, all of its economic vehicles. And that, what we see, is what's being implemented by the board. They're really carrying out an economic vision that, you know, Promise was designed to do, that is exactly also in line with what the investors wanted. So under the principles of odious debt, that would be declared odious and unpayable, the same way that it was declared unpayable by the governor 4 years ago. But out of, you know, moral and equitable obligations of the people of Puerto Rico, the same way that the people of Puerto Rico are being forced to pay for the control board, $370 million over 5 years in administrative costs for the control board, that they shouldn't be forced to pay for the debt. So it really shifts the power relationship, it shifts our understanding of who is criminal, of what actions are criminal, of who's responsible here. And more than just a moral calling to say, well, this is unfair, this inherently feels unfair to us and unsustainable to us, it really centers it also on some legal principles and grounding to say that the real criminality here, and where we should be looking, you know, when we go to watch the court proceedings, 500 Pearl Street, that they should be criminal proceedings. There should be prosecutors there, right? That there should be there should be a whole different set of arguments, really, that we should be supporting that's beyond just kind of our own sense of righteousness. Okay, I don't know how to
Can you just comment, if So since the book has come out, now the Committee of Natural Resources, they've been investigating PROMESA, and now there's these propositions to democratize it. Or so can you just say what I'm sure is a very critical take that you must have on that, and how we should be thinking about that?
Yeah, so the chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee, which is the committee of the House that has oversight over the territories, which is just a really nice way of saying colonies, a sanitized way of saying it. Visited Grijalva, Representative Grijalva visited Puerto Rico this past week, I think, last week or two. And since the spring has really been looking at ways to try, since the Democrats took office, control of the House, been looking at ways to try to make PROMESA more palatable. The same way that they're trying to do with a number of initiatives to say, hey, we're doing something. We can't get it passed because of the Senate, but we're going to do something. But it really is just that. It's intended to be symbolic. So first of all, you cannot democratize PROMESA. PROMESA includes the most undemocratic action, which is the control board. Right? It is a model that only exists in a colonial context, where you have 7 individuals who come from financial services, who come from the very institutions that are responsible for indebting the nation, that have absolutely no accountability to anyone besides Congress, that are unelected, that have veto power over the elected government, that meet in private, that have no transparency or accountability, that there's no public hearings, that they have their own lobbyists, they have their own lawyers, and they bill the people of Puerto Rico for all that they serve in their individual capacity. It is a model that is only sustainable and exists in the context of a colony. So you cannot democratize that. Right? There's no way of democratizing colonialism. Okay? And that was deemed to be a legitimate delegation of authority, of congressional authority, to this board. This board represents Congress. The Supreme Court repeatedly, as recent as 3 years ago, has said that Congress has the authority to do what it wants, to dispose of Puerto Rico however it wants. And Puerto Rico has no separate source of sovereignty or autonomy at all, except what Congress gives it. At any point, Congress can veto their decisions. They can oppose the governor the way they did for the first 50 years. And at this point, they can delegate their authority to a 7-member control board of bankers and executives. That's what they decided to do. So any effort by Congress at this point to sanitize PROMESA is just that. Unless they're going to do away with PROMESA, in particular the control board, then it's lip service. So this idea that we're going to define essential services, perhaps they're going to define essential services, they're going to do it after the fiscal plan has been approved and after the plan of adjustment has been approved, and none of that will be able to take effect until next year when the budget, when whatever they're legislating now goes into effect, right? So it's done. It's really intended to say, hey, as Democrats, we did something. But it's not going to have any meaningful impact on the lives of Puerto Ricans. Because the board would have already pushed through an economic vision that's going to bind the island for the next 2 generations. So however they're talking about saving education and healthcare and prioritizing it 3 years later is going to be irrelevant. And 2 years after the hurricane. Okay? Because the damage has already been done. So I would really caution us, whatever discourse comes out of Washington should be rigorously critiqued. And it's an intent to backtrack because they recognize how damaging the board and PROMESA has been, and that it was Democrats that pushed that through. And instead of acknowledging that and being honest about, well, what is a different response, particularly after the summer, because this summer wasn't about just Ricky and Brusi and Wanda. It was about a new model of self-governance. The board was central to the demands, right? Ricky renuncia y llévate la junta, right? It was really re-envisioning how governance, new models of governance, and self-governance can exist and be. So this is what I also see as a congressional response to that, to say, suave. And anytime, the empire says suave is when you need to rebel.
We want to definitely have time for the discussion and Q&A. pero
Yeah, I need to stand up because I cannot speak otherwise. I do this little dance with my feet, but also because I brought photos in order to keep sort of myself on track. So what I wanted to do, our chapter, I wrote it with my friend and colleague, Lycia. Our chapter has to do with dismantling public education in Puerto Rico. And by public education, we mean both the K-12 system, the schools, and the higher education system, which basically means the University of Puerto Rico, which has, for now, 11 campuses. So part of, I'm glad Natasha came before I did, right? Because part of the, I wanna try to keep myself on time by, instead of summarizing my chapter, try to give you like 3 big takeaways from it, and then you can read it or talk to me or whatever. So the first takeaway is, like Natasha was saying, this is not understandable, intelligible, unless you look at it in the context of the obvious debt, right? And the debt can be conceived of as the first hurricane, or the 3 hurricanes, Debt, Irma, and Maria, right? Those were the hurricanes that provided the context for this combination of disaster colonialism and disaster capitalism to take over, right? And do things like not only the junta, but los planes fiscales, and all these things that are going to render essential services when they finally define them more or less irrelevant. So one of the things I want to say about the debt, and this is just an example, is in 2015, when then Governor Garcia Padilla declared the debt unpayable, the hedge fund managers, the hedge funds in general, they freaked out. Right? They totally freaked out, and they started this campaign against any form of restructuring of the debt and pushing for the island to pay its debt in full. And one of the centerpieces of this campaign was this report. This report was ironically titled, "For Puerto Rico, There is a Better Way."
Yeah.
Right? And then I want to put attention to this report because if you see, it has a fiscal reform measures section, an expense cuts, budget cuts section, and a structural reform measures section. And if you notice, out of the 4 budget cuts section, 2 have to do with education. Reducing the number of teachers. This is 2015. The junta doesn't exist yet, Promesa doesn't exist yet. Right? In 2015, they were already saying, let's reduce the number of teachers in the K-12 system, and let's reduce the subsidy funds to the University of Puerto Rico. So I think it's crucial. This is one of several reports published during this time and before, including the Google report, which came years before that. So I want to sort of set the stage by saying that the hedge funds and the debt owners were already thinking in terms of taking advantage of a hurricane. It wasn't Maria yet. It was the debt itself that was a hurricane, and that was used as an excuse to do a bunch of things. Now, the students, of course, the university students knew before anybody else and said before anybody else, this is bad. The junta that they're proposing, promesa, is bad. Que la paguen los ricos, la deuda, right? So they got to the state, went to the streets, they spearheaded this movement, and some of us listened and some of us didn't, and some of us listened but sort of stayed complacent about it, you know. So, but they are usually the first ones to react, right? And I think one of the lessons of this is that we really need to learn to pay attention to them, right? So one of the things I wanna, then the first takeaway, right, will be that the debt is essential to understand the context. It's the first hurricane. The second takeaway has to do with the schools and what they did to the schools. Let's keep in mind that before Hurricane Maria, there have been already school closures. Over 100 schools were closed. At that point, they had only one public criteria. I mean, they closed whatever they want, but they had one public criteria. The school had to be in bad shape.
Yeah.
Speaking about infrastructure, right? So they had to make the case, they didn't have to, but they sort of made the case for it being more expensive to maintain the school than to keep it open, right? That was the excuse at that time. And all kinds of schools were closed, especially high schools, right? In Mayagüez, where I live and used to work, it was high schools. But after Maria, you know, and under the new academy regime, although she wasn't after also before that, and under Ricky Rosselló, after Maria, they took that as an opportunity to leave schools closed. Even when parents were trying to go in and fix them, even when teachers were trying to go in and fix them. right? And at that point, they not only left some schools closed, but also publish is too big a word. It does them a favor because they didn't really make it completely public, right? They started making some statements along the lines of, we're going to close some schools. How many? 200, 300, 400, 150, we don't know, right? So in the end, they ended up closing a third of the Puerto Rican schools, mostly elementary schools. Right? And then there were cited this time 3 criteria. The school supposedly had to be in bad shape, or it could have poor performance, the kids were not learning, or the third criteria was it could have too low a student population, especially after the exodus, after Maria, without taking into account that those people could come back, right? And that the closing of schools was actually pushing the exodus, making more people leave. Anyway, I chose this case study, this example. This is a school in Cayenne. And I chose this example because this happened a lot of times, and it sort of not only questions but reveals the hypocrisy of the school closure process, right? This is a teacher, an excellent teacher, whose school was closed. And this is the first time, I went with her the first time she visited the school after it closed. Her name is Carmen. She's one of those luminous beings that somehow manages to be bright even when she's sad, right? And she was incredibly sad as we walked around the school. The special thing about this, especially in many ways, one of the special things about this school in terms of a case study is that it was una escuela de excelencia. The very department that closed it had recognized it as a school with extraordinary academic achievement. Its infrastructure, su planta física, was in perfect shape, partly because there were parent committees that made sure that the school was in good shape at all times. And third, when the government removed 6th grade from the school, trying to lower the student population artificially, the director of the school created a pre-kindergarten, which filled immediately with people, so the student population of the school remained constant. They still closed the school. This has several meanings. The community where this school is located, you see why I have to stand up, right? The community where the school was located was an underserved community, incredibly poor. Very few communities of that sort get schools of this quality. Right? So they closed a treasure for this community and for these amazing teachers and really involved parents. Right? Let's keep going. This used to be in that same school. To the left, there was the social worker area. It was separated from the rest of the classroom. It's hard to see there, but it was in the midst of a bunch of trees, like very beautiful vegetation. We're talking about Cayenne, Puerto Rico. Very beautiful vegetation. It was a lovely, lovely space. This was Carmen's classroom, the teacher I interviewed and walked around with. This is what was left of it. For a year, parents were able to protect the school from vandalism and birds and heroin addicts and so forth. But after a year, it was too much to ask, right? And the school started deteriorating. So now the government can use infrastructure as an excuse. Yeah? Now, that's not the only school that serves as an example of government hypocrisy. This other school is a rural school located in a rural area. It fit 2 of the criteria. It was relatively low performing in terms of la prueba puertorriqueña standardized testing. And it was also low population because the communities it served were not big communities. Now, the communities it served were isolated communities. So when these schools closed, the rural schools, when they closed, those kids were sent to Segunda Unidad, middle schools downtown. Parents didn't want to send their 3rd graders to Segunda Unidades, where they were bullied and mistreated. They also cannot rely on the public transportation system, partly because there's no public transportation system. The public transportation system was privatized many, many years ago, right? So they cannot really rely on it. So right now, there's kids from that community that are not going to school, that are effectively out of the system. And nobody has noticed, and nobody says anything, right?
¿Esto en Calle también?
Eso es Calle también, en la montaña.
Ok, gracias.
This school also throws into sort of sharp relief the hypocrisy of the government, because this is also a rural school that had higher levels of accomplishment in the Puerto Ricanas and was turning into a Montessori school. was in the process of turning into a Montessori school. The teachers had paid for their own training so that they could turn it into a Montessori school. Kelleher said publicly con su boca de comer that Montessori schools were not going to be closed. This school was closed. I saw it, right? And abandoned. The teachers have been thrown everywhere else. They cannot practice the Montessori skills that they trained for. And the kids, again, have either left school or sent to middle schools downtown, where they're not happy. And also you have to take into account the fact that 4 out of 10, 40% of Puerto Rican kids need special education services. And one of the big issues with closing schools is that it's really hard for parents to get those special education services in the new schools. By law, they need them, and by law, they have to receive them, but the government has been dragging their feet in terms of providing those services. Now, the process, the attack on public higher education is a little bit different, right? What they do with public higher education is, first, they started a war on shared governance. And those of you who are academics know that there's a set of not always functional, but good to have, shared governance structures within any public university, in particular the Senate, committees, Junta Universitaria, and so forth. People who keep their presidents and even the state and city governments accountable, right? Or they're supposed to. Well, the first thing that happened is the Junta de Control Fiscal asked for these draconian budget cuts, and nobody could produce them. Not even the worst presidents that I ever seen in my life could produce a fiscal plan that, that included budget cuts this size without breaking apart the university, without increasing tuition extremely high, or without closing campuses, right? So no matter what they do, increasing tuition, closing campuses, shrinking campuses, no matter what they do, the end result, and this is important, is that the higher education, the public higher education system is going to shrink dramatically. And this is important because not only there, but here at CUNY, or any public university that serves underserved students, the students that are left out when the university shrinks are always, always, always those that come from the most vulnerable populations. I can show you numbers for this, right? And then here's another connection with the Lehman, no? And the odious debt. Yeah. And it's that students who are displaced from the university system take their BKP, which factually seems works as a voucher of sorts, because it allows them to go and study in any accredited place, including for-profit universities. They take that check and they go to the university closest to them, which usually is a for-profit institution. So now what I have here is this one is a campus of the University of Puerto Rico, in Calle also, not because it's special in a particular way, just because to keep consistent, because I was thinking about Calle. And this is a comparison with other campuses. The first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 are private for-profits. All of them are for-profit education campuses. The blue line is the graduation rate of that place. The orange line is the student debt after they go. So you want the blue line to be high and the debt line to be low, right? Which is what happens when you go there to the University of Puerto Rico in Calle, but it's not what happens over here. Ahora te digo. NUC stands for National University College. National University College, together with EDP, together with Junior College, together with Instituto de Banca, together with all the institutions we thought were like separated and independent campuses, independent from each other, they have been all purchased by Leeds. Leeds is a company very sick that together with Goldman Sachs and Apollo Management, the three of them together own 60% of all the for-profit education institutions in the US. And they're basically taking over. And they're not graduating students, right? But they're leaving them with debt. So these students are indebted. So the country is in debt, and our students are in debt as well. And the people we're paying are the same people. Goldman Sachs, Leeds, Apollo Management, and those people are also the same that authored the report I showed you at the beginning. right? The report that says we have to cut funds from the university, of course we do, right? And this one I included here. This one is always like a little bit tricky because this is a non-profit. Es el Sistema Universitario Ana Geméndez, right? This is the Recinto de Carolina campus. Now, that one is tricky because it is a non-profit. But as far as non-profits go, it is an extremely profitable one. Particularly when it comes to executive salaries. Executive salaries in Ana Geméndez, I don't mean the teacher salaries, those are really, really low. Executive salaries, and Ana Geméndez, rectores and presidents and so forth, those are comparable to executive salaries in for-profits. Ana Geméndez has also recently developed a new sort of, una pata for-profit, like a new for-profit leg to expand in Florida and heavily recruits Puerto Rican students that have had to leave the island. So that's why I included it there. And Phoenix, I'm going out of. Phoenix is an outlier. It belongs to Apollo Management, one of the producers of that report I showed you at first. Phoenix is an outlier because it looks like it has a lot of debt, but also a high graduation rate. The problem with Phoenix is that the kinds of jobs that students get are not enough to pay the debt. They're very low salary jobs. So I guess, there's so much I could say about these things, right? But I guess what I would like to say is something along these lines. Schools and universities, although a relatively neglected topic in the context of the debt and the hurricane, because beyond the idea of school closures, really these things are not very much discussed in the national and US media. School closings, the destruction of the public lower education system, the destruction of the public higher education system is part of the same process that moves everything from the realm of the public to the realm of the private. And the modus operandi is clear. First they come in and destroy. Then they take us and they atomize us. And once we are atoms, now we think of ourselves, now that we think of ourselves as individuals, and we stop behaving as communities, and we stop participating in communities, because we're busy with, say, making sure our kids get educational services that they need, right? Once that happens, then they hit us, right? Then they hit us and nos roban el agua, nos roban la luz, nos roban la belleza misma en forma de la playa, right? Nos roban la tierra, nos roban todas estas cosas, nos roban las comunicaciones, nos roban la luz, el agua, los caminos, nos roban las escuelas. Nos roban las escuelas y las universidades, que son justamente las productoras de las herramientas que necesitamos para el pensamiento y para la voluntad. Schooling is what we need to develop, it provides the schools, the tools that we need to develop thinking, to develop critical thinking, to develop even the will to fight against these things, right? They take everything away from us, and they have the nerve, la caradura, of selling it back to us for a price that gets us in debt, right? So, país endeudado, sujeto endeudado. And el modus operandi está claro. Si el modus operandi es atomizar, la única forma de resistencia posible es juntar. If the MO is to destroy and separate, the only kind of possible resistance that we can think of is bring back together and unite. And hope somebody talks about asambleas de pueblo. And I think Sara has a few happier cases to discuss. Thank you.
But I think it'll be a good transition to hear from Sarah, what happens is atomization, how are people fighting back against it, and how do we see other responses.
So thank you, Yarimar and Marisol, for putting together this amazing collection, and it's just such an honor to be sharing the book and sharing the space with four amazing women that I really admire. So I'm an anthropologist. I'm studying my PhD at CUNY, at the Graduate Center. And my chapter is called Authenticating Loss and Contesting Recovery. It's It's based on about a year and a half of ethnographic work I did in Puerto Rico. I just got back about 2 weeks ago to start the semester. And I think this is very related to what Natasha and Rima were talking about, because we're all questioning these structures of debt, of education reform, and of recovery. That's what my chapter is about. My chapter really problematizes this dominant framework and model of disaster recovery, this institutional approach that's characterized, it's very individualistic, it's market-driven, right? And you can think about the institutions that promote this kind of recovery model are, right, the state, the local, and the federal government, the colonial government, and institutions like FEMA, and even the local Puerto Rican Negociado de Manejo de Emergencia, the local emergency management organization. So my chapter, I'm gonna try to go quickly because I think we're running, we have like 10 minutes.
There's no question after.
Good, we can say
Yeah, so my chapter, there's two parts. It also problematizes the idea of temporality of disaster that Yarimar opened with, this notion, and the temporality of recovery, right? This notion that one moves, actually it's his or her process of quote unquote recovery, you know, from the emergency to the response, right? Various institutions come in during the response, then recovery, and then recuperation is like a national project. So my chapter focuses on one woman's experience from a community I worked in Caguas, navigating the disaster aid process, right? And I call this a process of slow violence or bureaucratic violence. So it seems to be mundane, it's not spectacular violence, that kind of thing, right? This is a lot about dealing with documents, phone calls, technologies that weren't working, and a whole system that just didn't make sense, right? So she's specifically navigating FEMA, the Individual Disaster Aid Assistance, and Tu Hogar Renace, which I'm sure most of us have seen the disaster that was itself. So she actually was with a blue tarp on her roof, as a roof, until June of this year, June of 2019. So this is a bit of an update too. And actually it was a nonprofit organization working in the community that put a zinc roof, replaced the blue tarp with a zinc roof in June of this year. So I talk about this process of slow violence that especially low-income and racialized populations have experienced throughout this entire quote-unquote recovery process. And I also draw on the experience of disaster workers. So the very low-paid Puerto Rican workers who were contracted by FEMA, by Tu Hogar Renace, to authenticate and evaluate damage and loss in people's homes, and go back to check appeal statuses and that kind of stuff. And it was very interesting what they told me. There was this this tension because oftentimes people want the disaster workers wanted to add more to these very formulaic, these formulaic and kind of mechanized evaluation processes that were just basic surveys, fill in the bubble kind of things, very short comments that they could make, and the limited amount of photos, right? So, and they weren't making the decisions about this evaluation. The evaluations were brought to the top to FEMA that ultimately made the decisions, very disconnected from, the real life experience of someone. So that's kind of the first part. And the second part is about contested recoveries. And I focus on the project of a Centro de Apoyo Mutuo, a mutual support center that emerged actually in this woman's same community. She was part of this initiative. And these CAMs emerged after Maria as a kind of all over the archipelago. It was really an amazing emergence of autogestión, right, in the wake of Maria. And my main argument is that this kind of politics of apoyo mutuo that's demonstrated in this specific mutual support center that I spent a lot of time in and with these women, it's challenges and actually refuses the kind of disaster recovery that's promoted by institutions like FEMA, right? It is about the collective, so kind of.
I was hoping you.
I love it. Right, so it's about things like care work. It's about things like affective relationalities. and spatial occupations, right? Spatial rescues and occupations in the community. So this community actually rescued their school.
I know,
Yeah,
that's awesome.
yeah. So the women, sure. So the kind of care work that the women are doing in this and it's interesting because it's women and elderly are the protagonist in this project. So populations that we often think about as victims, right, are actually protagonizing a different kind of alternative recovery that I think refuses a more institutional idea of recovery. And the affective relationalities, it has a lot to do with food. It has a lot to do with visiting people in their community, with getting to know people, right, because of the basic survival needs after Maria. And the community was totally abandoned. So in essence, they're filling a lot of the failures of the state, but the affective relations are there, and connecting with people, especially the elderly, right, who are abandoned in different kinds of ways, right, and often alone with their caregivers. These affective relationalities, like through food, through lunches, this is very important. To have people in your community that are caring about you and that are thinking about, you know, what's the people in your home who might need help in the next disaster, right? And that's not the model of an institutional framework, right? That's very individualized. So, let's see.
Sure.
Just a few more things. I talked about this kind of formation of the disaster subject, right? The proper disaster subject, and that's basically the idea that the individual is in charge of their own disaster preparation. And this idea is promoted by this FEMA's approach that is really to form and shape this neoliberal disaster subject, right? Who can take care of themselves, not depend on handouts. They use the language of culture of preparedness, right? So they're part of this culture of preparedness, and they can do all kinds of behavioral changes to become part of this culture. And it's not going to work. It didn't work, and I don't think it's going to work for what the challenges of climate change and the realities of people's lives. So that was basically the argument of the chapter. And I think, should we maybe go to?
Sure.
Yeah.
Is there anything you want to say about from when the chapter was written to now? I mean, there's been the FEMA arrest.
Yes.
There's also yesterday in the newspaper, the community that you work with was featured in Rima and is there any other? And I noticed in the little video they showed of the community, the women, they said very clearly this is not just about giving aid, but also that cariño.
Exacto.
Yeah.
Cariño,
Yeah.
sí.
Which I think that in the face of this like a feeling state abandonment, which I think part of what is so important about your chapter and your work in general, because you moved beyond thinking about things like that audit, which I see you with your auditoria shirt, and these kind of abstract legal processes that, you know, Natasha started us off with, this institutional violence that Rima is telling us about, you know, how that's not just experienced financially or in a kind of abstract way, but really in something that has to do with emotions, right? And I think that the fact that for these women, part of what was so important was to give care and love and emotion, and how a lot of that emotion that's also about indignación and sorrow and mourning, how all of that, I think, also paved the way for the Lycia movement, you know, that we can't understand what would lead people to feel indignation and outrage over, you know, these text messages without understanding all these emotions.
Yeah, I just to give an anecdote about Hurricane Dorian, that actually Hurricane Dorian provides us a very interesting lens to think about a lot of these things. The kind of climate anxiety, what I want to think about as climate anxiety, was so present the week that Dorian was supposed to hit Puerto Rico, even as a Category 1, right? So in the CAM that I was collaborating with, the women were not so concerned about, you know, as FEMA and the Negociado de Emergencia in Puerto Rico would you know, say, getting 10 days of food and water for everyone in your house, making sure your savings is available in your bank, you know, having your backup generator ready. That wasn't the concern. Their concern was getting the food supplies ready to prepare for the lack of electricity and to prepare for the failure of the government. They weren't preparing for a storm. They were preparing for the state to fail. And they were preparing for how they were going to collectively organize to once again respond to a possible emergency of a Category 1 hurricane. So they were getting all the cans ready to open up the school in the wake of what Dorian could have brought, right? And so the school is so important. The school is really the center of their struggle right now. They've had an application for over a year and a half to the Department of Infrastructure because Rosalio promised this very kind of quick process of renting out the closed schools to community organizations. Interestingly, organizations with political ties and religious organizations, go through a quite speedy process to rent the schools for $1. But this has been neglected and ignored on purpose. So I think that Dorian kind of provides an interesting lens to talk about this. And the issue of property too, because the title now for the CAM, the Centro de Apoyo Mutuo, is very important when they're depending on things like donations, right? And unfortunately, a lot of foundations that are now working in Puerto Rico are also demanding that organizations and nonprofits are, fully complying with the law. They have their nonprofit certificate, and of course, if they're operating in a closed building, that they have a title to that, or they're renting this, in a formal way. So the chapter also deals with property as a kind of disciplining tool, right? Not only to create a disaster subject that is a private property owning individual with flood and home insurance, and then property becomes an exclusionary tool and a discipline tool in various ways in this kind of recovery context. And the school is another way that that's happening. But they've served 33,000 meals since November 2017. So that's incredible. That's incredible. They're still cooking 3 times a week and serving meals to 70 people in their community, elderly residents.
Thank you. So I want to open up for questions, and I'll just say we'll stay here for a while, and we'll be signing books. The books are for sale in the atrium, and you can get them signed by all these ladies. So yes, Eduardo?
I have a question. The New York Times reported this, they had a piece on education this week. And one of the things that caught my eye is that there's supposedly like $589 million were assigned for rebuilding and reopening schools that were damaged. But as of March, only 4% has been used, and this money expires next year. Why do you think that money is not being utilized?
Can we take a couple of questions? Sure. Yeah. Other questions or comments? Yes, I see a hand in the back. Yes.
I see a hand in the back. So when you talk about the culture of preparedness and that it fetishizes or focuses too much on individual preparedness and household preparedness, I'm really looking forward to reading the book. I'm going to buy it, and I'm definitely going to ask all of you to sign it. To what extent, though, would a culture of preparedness that is more community-focused or more communal in nature be a way to go, or be a way of altering how the federal government particularly approaches these issues?
One more question? I like threes. Yes.
First of all, thank you. I think we should get like a superhero cartoon. Superwoman. Yeah, right. My question is regarding the odious debt. What stuck out to me was, how we're not going to abolish it through legal means. What do you think is the best way to go about kind of pushing this abolish the debt, movement, if you will?
Have Trump pay it.
And can I just add to that too? Like maybe think about abolishing auditing. What's the relationship? What's the difference? Anybody else want to get in on this first round of questions? Okay, you guys want to address that?
So the first question was about education, so I want to say something about that, but also I want to lead into the question that was meant for Sarah, because I think there's a connection there that I would really love that we explore together at some point. So in terms of the practical side of the question, right, how come that money is not there, how come it's not being used, it's going to expire, come on, it's free money. So that question has to do with Of course, issues at the federal government, the fact that Trump's government has made it slower because, in his words, we're not only corrupt, we're also lazy and incompetent and all kinds of, he's called us all kinds of stuff, right? So that's part of the strategy for making the money go slow and get there late. Now, once it gets there, the idea of rebuilding is very broadly interpreted. So, for example, some of that money has been used to purchase vagones, containers. And those containers have been purchased overpriced, like they purchase always everything at the Department of Education for some reason. They've been purchased to expand the capacity of mostly middle schools that suddenly become segunda unidad and have to welcome all these kids from elementary schools, right? Some containers are especially designed for special needs students, which sort of has all kinds of complications, right? So those are some of the issues. The bureaucracy at the federal level, that money getting to Puerto Rico, the bureaucracy at the local level, and then let's not diminish the fact that Kelleher was arrested, and that some of her people were also arrested. So that's making everything slower. You know, you never see the current Secretary of Education in the news. It's like this, there's a concept in disaster capitalism that has been applied to the universities. It's called the hollow state, right? The disaster profiteering is facilitated by the creation, or rather the sort of, no me acuerdo de la palabra ahora, by the production of this hollow state that has very little power except serving as a conduit, right, for money to get to private hands. And I think that's part of the reason that's happening here. Also, let's not, we can talk about that later. I want to get to Sarah and her idea that property is being used as a disciplining tool, because it is also used as part of the atomization plan that I talked about, right? So when you force people to prove the property rights to a space, you're forcing people to separate, individuals that can own, because only individuals and organizations can own property legally, right? So once you achieve that separation, then that's the step that they need in order to sell the property, in some cases, for $1. Right? In the case of some schools.
Yeah, and just to add to that, the issue of property, there's hundreds of millions of dollars right now allocated to what's called title clearance programs, right? And we need to be grateful to legal advocates organizations like Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico, right, that are forcing the government and the Department of Housing at the local and federal level to clarify their plans, right, and they're working to get the money to the communities that it needs to go to. But the issue of this title clearance for individual homes is very connected to the CDBG-DR funds. It's very connected and has to be understood in this kind of ecosystem of opportunity zones and the new mapa the zoning classification maps, sin zonificación, that are being tested right now in Puerto Rico. So all of this, I think, is working together to bring land speculation and displacement, right? They're all in conversation with each other, these programs. That's why I'm really interested in why property becomes a concern after a disaster. And we see this in Haiti. This happened, the Clinton Foundation sponsored a similar title clearance program in Haiti right after the earthquake, right? So this is a kind of repeating phenomenon. The issue of culture of preparedness, keyword of neoliberalism. That's, I guess my question would be like, who needs to be part of this culture of preparedness, right? Because the ruling class doesn't, right? They're always kind of prepared. They have a lot of ways of preparing and actually escaping any quote unquote disaster. So I think that the culture of preparedness is particularly used as part of neoliberal disaster governance, this idea that, the individual and specifically lower income communities need to be kind of preparing themselves, not worrying about if the government's going to help you, because they're not and they shouldn't. And you really just need to kind of get, 10 days of food and water for all the people in your homes and buy flood insurance, right? So it's a market issue, and also debt functions here too. The culture of preparedness is also about promoting things like SBA loans, right? And personal loans, indebting as a mechanism to recover, yourself. Just another example, the Negociado de Manejo de Emergencia in Puerto Rico, the local emergency management agency, their whole campaign in the 2019 hurricane season is called "Tú estás preparado?" It's a question. Tú. So again, the question is who needs to be prepared, right? And this is like an ethnographic anecdote. So they have a test, actually an online quiz in this campaign, "Tú estás preparado?" that you're supposed to take, right? It's a quiz to prepare, and it comes out with this algorithm of a family's hurricane preparedness plan. It's really fascinating. You guys should check it out. And the questions exactly. I took the test myself. I have my report. You know, my one person household emergency preparedness plan. So this is the culture of preparedness that they're talking about, and it's very much excusing the state's role, excusing the role of the public, and what a just recovery really should look like.
And then I can just add to that before going to Natasha. I think that a lot of that, we see this in other disaster contexts, but there's a particularity in Puerto Rico where this was all, this self-reliance, y tú tienes que prepararte, y it's up to you, no te quites, all this focus on the individual was already, that groundwork was already laid with the debt crisis, you know, so that individual responsibility, because the state is broke, the state can't help you, the state is an empty vessel, right? So how that, you know, that narrative around the debt then comes together with the neoliberal recovery narrative that is not particular to Puerto Rico but gets intensified, you know, is something to think about really carefully. So how do we deal with the debt, Natasha?
Well, I want to touch on all the questions really quickly. The first around the first question was
Disbursement of funds.
Education?
the funds, the disbursement of funds. I just want to mention quickly, so, you know, Congress, if you look at Trump's Twitter feed, you would think that $100 billion has been allocated for Puerto Rico. We know that that's not true. It's more like closer to 30 billion. That's been allocated, not released, right? HUD, which is now the primary vehicle with which most federal funding is being, you know, directed to the islands, no longer FEMA, has refused to release the funds that have already been allocated. And the official response is something like, well, there's corruption. We're not sure how it's going to be managed. And I really want us to be cautious with that discourse. One, there's corruption everywhere, right? Just a few years ago, half of the New York State leadership was arrested in jail because of corruption. And nobody would ever think of withholding federal funds for New York as a result, right? And what I think, so it's withheld for Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, while it was released for Florida and Texas, very large, primarily Republican congressional delegations. My sense is that it's really intended to punish the island for some outspoken political leadership, but also for this summer's actions. Right? For this sense of like, how dare you rebel? One, you're not a political priority for us, so this is optional when and how we send you this money. Even though Congress, you know, has allocated it, I get to decide how I want that to be dispersed, but also it depends on how well you behave. So we'll decide how much and when you get it and for what kinds of projects. So I think that that's part of the aspect of why funding is being kind of held up and not spent. The other piece, which is around kind of property and to your point of preparedness, to show how FEMA is really playing, you know, such a critical central role in the massive displacement that's happening on the island, is not only is it kind of this culture of preparedness, this individualization of preparation, which was rejected after the hurricane when you really think about how many systems of interdependency were built amongst communities in the face of total government abandonment and neglect, but that FEMA denied 62% of household claims, 62% of individual claims to repair their homes, their own property, right, were denied. What does that mean? It means you either live in, you know, homes that are not safe or secure, or still have a blue tarp, and one of the 30,000 homes is still have a blue tarp, or one of the 300,000 homes that have never been repaired, or you're part of the forced migration, or you have to leave that property to find another property, that property becomes part of the zoning plans, right, for displacement, and really ultimately a reconfiguration and a restructuring of society to decide what is this economic vision for Puerto Rico, and it is contingent on FEMA's role, and it's contingent on what I heard a South African term once, to your point about civil violence, administrative violence. It's really designed for from here to 20 years to have a Puerto Rico that looks much more like South Beach and much less like Miami. To the point about, you know, the debt, there's kind of an ongoing conversation in some sections around, well, is it an audit of the debt, which does that kind of implicitly acknowledge or accept the debt, and are we just saying we want to parse it out and think about what part is lawful, what part's not lawful? Do we want to reject it in its entirety under the principles of odiousness? In order for a debt to be argued to be odious or declared, theoretically it should be the governor that says, I'm not going to pay the debt. Right? That is now, even if this governor or any governor were to do that, it's a bit out of their hands because it's the control board that's negotiating the debt, and the you know, negotiating, I say very lightly. But there's a, you know, there's a campaign to cancel the debt, and the audit, auditoria, the auditing of the debt campaign, which has been very successful, I think is important. I don't actually think undermines the demand to have the debt be declared odious or illegitimate. Right? I think, as I see it, and this may not be how the campaign sees it, I see it as a tactic for what is the right to, you know, access to information, that people, you know, if you're going to be charged with something, you have the right to understand what that is. And while there are those that are much more aligned with, the belief in the criminality of the debt, there are others that aren't so sure because of how individualized this has been. Well, if you were irresponsible and you indebted yourself, then you should be forced to pay. That's been the narrative that's been sold, right? Or you have an individual responsibility in paying your debts. That's not a narrative that fits the situation, but that folks have bought into in some way, or feel that if they don't, that because there's a culture of fear that's perpetuated constantly, that's the nature of being a colony, is that it requires your complicity. It requires that there be fear in it, right? Because God forbid you dare to rebel against that or dream beyond that, or have demands beyond the fear, that it means, oh God, we won't have access to the markets, this is gonna collapse. Well, everything is collapsed. Everything is already collapsed, right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing, that it's collapsing. But I see the auditing demands as a campaign to then have the debt be declared illegitimate. Right? That it's really an educational campaign and targeting as an organizing strategy, as I see it, to bring people on board with what they may inherently feel is unjust, because you see it in your sales tax, you see it in the lack of services that are being provided, you see it in the school being closed, but now you have a language with which to do it. Right? And then hopefully that'll lead towards the cancellation.
Can I say another piece about that precisely? I was discussing this with some of the people that are involved in the campaign recently, and they think, and I totally agree, that it is also about accountability. And part of the way they're going about this is precisely to look at each bond emission separately, right? That way you can see not only which individuals, governors, or whatever were in charge by the time a particular bond emission came out. You can also see the involvement of people like Goldman Sachs. You can see individual bufetes de abogados, individual legal law firms in Puerto Rico and the US involved in particular bond sales and bond emissions. You can see lobbyists, right? All that information is part of the debt auditing process. And that's the kind of information I want to have, regardless of whether or not the debt is paid or not paid. We need that information, even if the debt is pardoned, forgiven tomorrow, I still want to know who did it.
That's right.
Just quickly, there's a conversation happening today, and a campaign that started yesterday on debt and reparations, ID Puerto Rico. This is happening now in Puerto Rico, and I think this is adding another layer of complexity and a really important conversation to the question of the debt and an inter-Caribbean dialogue about debt and reparations.
Okay, so Arcadio have to give you. No, sí, dale, cogemos, vamos así como clockwise, o
Well, first of all, thank you for the book, thank you for the essays, for the hard work, and for the presentations today. What I admire a great deal is that you all have been able to do something that I find incredibly difficult, and the complexity of the Puerto Rican situation and history is so huge. And it is to do a history of the present. And that's something to be truly appreciated. To do a history of the present in a very complex situation where there are no ready-made languages, and to sort of improvise and invent language as you go along, all these days and so many others, and to emphasize also the emotional understanding, which today was very clear in your presentations and in the essays as well. So I think this is extremely important and to be really appreciated. And I have a question in relation to that because I wasn't here yesterday, maybe it was touched upon in the discussion, but my question having to do with the history of the present and the emotional understanding has to do with the protests and your take on the protests, since that happened after you wrote your essays. And it has to do with the pancartas and the slogans, and the many issues that were raised, gender, sexual discrimination, humiliations, the violence, the elite, los blanquitos too, which I think we don't talk enough about that, the complicity. But my question has to do with one word that I saw very often when we were at home watching until 2 and 3 in the morning and seeing those wonderful creative pancartas. And the word is dignidad. It appears very frequently. Young people, older people, and I wanted your thoughts on that, because that's emotional understanding, but it's also philosophical and ethical understanding. How that concept, respect and dignity, was so powerful in those protests. What does it mean to you, for you, as members of the community and as persons who have been thinking about this very intensely? Because I found that very remarkable.
Yeah, my question was related to that and something that you mentioned before, Yarimar, and it was about if you could elaborate on those alternative practices that you were talking about that people developed during the crisis, during the disaster, or after the disaster, and how they infused the protests, how somehow these practices might have infused in many ways, in the performance, but also in the concept of what the protest itself was.
Well, yeah, thank you to all you guys too. I want to say that you guys, in my eyes, kind of like Avengers older. You're fighting real things, not some alternative universe. It's really more of a curiosity thing. It's like earlier today we talked about stuff that was happening in Puerto Rico, some MASH later, GSI stuff. That was cool. I'm curious if in any of your circles, conversations about human rights are happening, and in what context and what way.
Yeah, I want to get the last, because this will be the last round of questions. And Edwin, I'm going to save you for last, so you can have the last word. Yeah.
Me?
Yeah.
Well, the title of this session is Puerto Rico Before and After the Storm. I think that we can all agree that we're never going to be the same after the storm. About a week and so ago, the whole idea of going through another scenario of a hurricane, literally people were panicking. I think it's important to discuss the huge mental health issue that we are going through after the hurricane. If we're talking about recovery, all of the points that you're talking about are hugely relevant, important, and valid. But when are we going to start challenging ourselves? ourselves and think about the repercussions of the mental health issues that the Puerto Ricans are going through. You want to move forward. We all want to move forward and continue with our lives, and you know, everything that we're discussing is important. But I see children 2 weeks ago panicking, entirely out of themselves, families, like this aftershock continues as you know, we go into the hurricane season, and I think that it's important to discuss that in order for us to move forward and really recover. Even we have all the problems solved that you were talking about, what are we going to do with this issue?
So, thank you. Ditto. I really do agree that that is going to be an ongoing situation that as providers and as community we're going to continue to face. I was in Puerto Rico Centro last June and visited an old friend whose partner is a pharmacist in Old San Juan, and he said, cada vez que anuncian un aguacero, people then start going to the pharmacy and saying, can I get 3 months of my medications? And that just proves to us, validates that they are, you know, that our families, our friends are living in constant trauma, even when it's not even un anuncio como Dorian, es un aguacero, it's like, I gotta get my meds, if not, this might be the end of me. But what I wanted to share, Sarah, thank you very much for what you shared about what's going on in the local communities. When we were seeing the thousands that came through our doors, and we would be doing our intake, they would speak about the homes that they left. Whether they era de madera or de cemento, no importa. Some of them were in really bad shape. Some of them were left without roofs, and lots of documentation and pictures about the conditions. However, knowing FEMA, and he can't even go there, what all of the refusals that they were doing and the many times that we had to continue to assist in appealing their decision, families were in need though of support, and so they were applying for some benefits, whether they be federally or they were connected somehow to the disaster. My fear and my concern continues to be when the CDBG funds, DR funds, get released, especially when it's targeted around the titles. Will FEMA come back and be asking for the repayment of some of the services that they have been receiving? And if they don't pay, well, then they keep those homes now that they have a title.
Yes.
Yeah, I've been struggling over the last couple of days, and this workshop helped me formalize this thought. And I guess my question is going to be for Natasha. You know, the situation is bad, it's dire, it's desperate, but that doesn't seem to define it enough for me. And what this workshop helped me understand is this is pretty much cultural genocide. And I was wondering what if LatinoJustice has been thinking about taking this to an international court, because I know, you know, that's not a winning scenario, but it at least maybe one to help organize some of the political parties, some of the individuals running for Congress, running for the presidency, to start focusing on what really is happening in Puerto Rico. And I'm feeling this 1,500 miles away from Puerto Rico. I can only imagine what's happening in Puerto Rico.
Okay, Edwin, thank you for joining us. And
I was actually going to thank you all, especially those who come from afar, have to travel to be here. Thank you. And a fantastic conversation and a great panel. This is actually a very lively conversation that I hope I can continue. Personally, I have to go to the plenary because we run out of time and I have to be there. So I'm going to run out the minute after. But I hope that you can stay a little bit and sign your votes and you know, the sooner you can get to the plenary, the better. But I'm going to leave my copy, and I hope that you all sign it. And then Yarimar, you're responsible for bringing it back to the
I should say we have Arcadio who wrote the foreword, and Carlos here who also wrote a piece about the arts after Maria. So it's a special occasion. Yeah. And it's for sale in the so.
Thank you for the all woman panel.
¿Cómo?
Thank you for the all woman panel.
Yeah.
You hardly have those.
I don't know how people end up with all male panels, but that never happens. I just reach out to who can present important work. So can you guys, address some of the final questions, and then we will sign away.
Well, I was just going to say very quickly with the question about mental health, it was really important to us as also like the co-editors. It was something that we thought a lot about, and Patricia's piece as well, yes, is all about kind of psychoanalytical accompaniment, right, in the aftermath, right, really detailing the kind of mental health crisis that was already there, right? And so this is also the big thing is to realize that this has been a mental health crisis that was created and exacerbated by colonial conditions, by austerity, by the crisis in public health, right? That's been unfolding for years. But one of the things just quickly to know, right, is that like we begin the whole book with the story of this woman who we see that she leaves, right? She joins the diaspora, and as she joins the diaspora, her mental health crisis worsens, right? And so also one of the things for us to think about is the fact that this is something that is now really a transnational and diasporic crisis, right? That we have to figure out how to deal with and attend to, right? And so this is something that becomes really critical for us. It's not like people leave and then they get better, and in fact what we see is that sometimes that the fact that you can't go back makes your mental health crisis much worse, even though you might have better access to medication, you might have better medical care, right? There's a trauma that comes not only with having survived this ordeal, but what it means to be exiled, right? And so one of the things for us to then think about in relation to what the other panelists have been saying is that this complicates a narrative that things are going to get better with time, right? And in fact, what we might see is things get worse with time, right? So that's something for us to be attentive to as we are, 2, 3, 4 years out. We're we can't just be like, be more resilient, Puerto Rico se levanta, all of that kind of stuff, which Patricia's piece also deals with, right? Which individualizes what is a collective trauma. And Yarimar's piece also in conversation with Naomi Klein also details some of these issues. So I just want to put that out there, but it's something that definitely runs throughout the collection, something that we've been thinking about.
I'm gonna answer a few, try to bring them together. First, I'm so grateful for your question, and I don't know that we'll be able to answer it now, but in thinking about this summer and coming back to the word dignity, which was on display, and there's an annual march I came from for independence that happened today in front of the UN, and dignity was kind of on everyone's face much. And I think in the public discourse that often got reduced to, well, the moment, que se burlaron de nuestro pueblo. That was like it. But I actually think it's more than that. I mean, I think that there's something there that would be said about how dare you cross that line. But after Maria, really seeing how people redefine their relationship with the state when they realized that there would be no state to rescue them, which I think is such a critical break in a colonial mentality that requires your constant submission to a state, right? Your dependency. It really requires a dependency, in this case on the colonial government. And when not even the colonial government would show up, much less, los federales, and how people really turned to each other and learned this language of respect and dignity in a way that wasn't so obvious and present, but that understood that their collective survival was contingent upon a respect for life and each other's lives. That I saw on display this summer. And I also saw on display these demands for a different political vision. When I talk about a new model of self-government and self-governance, that it really was about the self, like all of ourselves, not the traditional partisan, even pro-independence nature that hasn't been inclusive, that a lot of people feel disconnected from, either the discourse or they never felt included or represented. That what we saw on display was really like we are enough, we are capable. Look what we survived. We can survive this government. We can survive corruption and fraud because we literally survived the most kind of intense attack on our existence, which wasn't the hurricane. No. It was the government neglect and abandonment to let people die. So I think that it's, and I think about it, that moment, I think about for the last, at least, 150 years, how many people fought and died for that moment that never got to live and see it, but that we're getting a chance to do that. In terms of human rights, and a couple of you guys kind of mentioned this in the international realm, just very briefly, I'll say, well, first, all of it's human rights. And there's so many groups in Puerto Rico that are doing human rights work, whether they call it that or not. It's all human rights, dignity work. But how we're surfacing that, because we're talking about not a humanitarian disaster, we're talking about a political disaster, a political crisis, an economic crisis, a social one, an existential one. And because Puerto Rico is a colony, it's very hard to surface that in any international forum. So there's a couple of ways that we've been trying to do that. And a lot of this work is either done in conjunction with or really being led in Puerto Rico, particularly by the Human Rights Clinic and Institute by Annette Martinez, and I want to name her particularly, to one, be present in as many international forums and spaces as possible, which is limited. So whether it's the Inter-American system, Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and there's been 3 hearings on Puerto Rico, 3 years in a row to specifically talk about this. The Commission has requested to come visit Puerto Rico. They have to request the United States. The United States has not officially granted them that right yet. The only space in the UN that we can occupy in the human rights context is directly either with independent experts, which we call special rapporteurs on different themes. They've visited, some have visited Puerto Rico, and talked about and really explicitly linked the economic crisis with the political crisis, which is really important. And there's an increased strategy to try to build in the political front in the UN. Eventually, this is a conversation that has to reach the General Assembly. This is not a conversation that's going to be solved by Congress. That's going to be solved, at least because there's no political will, it's not going to be solved by any U.S. tribunal. That it really requires a full meaning and understanding of the word solidarity, which we've seen examples from Palestinian liberation struggles, from Cuba, about what it means to build international networks of solidarity. Because there's no forum that exists that we can go to litigate our way out of this. Not even internationally, that we have access to. So what does it mean to build a movement like what's happening this weekend in Puerto Rico and looking at the Caribbean nature of debt, the Latin American nature of debt, right? And to eradicate disaster capitalism, climate disaster, and colonialism in the region once and for all. And that's a call that I think that we all have to make to each other and to our allies, the way that Puerto Ricans have really shown up in every struggle in this country, and it's really time that we ask our allies to show up for us in a way, because it's only going to be with political will that this gets shifted.
Final words?
Yeah, I want to say something really quick. I know I'm aware of the time, so I want to say something about only 2 of the questions. And we can talk about human rights later, because I'm affiliated with the Center of Human Rights and Peace Studies, and we'll have a conversation about that. But I'm going to address Arcadio's question, not question. I'm going to take with me a lot of the white stuff you said, and I'm going to address the question of dignity. Because I think a good metaphor for these affronts against dignity, which people have been using loosely, is the whole idea of containers, los vagones. There were all these containers of dead people in need, people who were not counted, people who were not cured, people who were killed by the aftermath of the hurricane. There were these containers that were used to store the kids whose schools were closed, right? historically there's been containers that are used to bring our food to Puerto Rico because we're depending on other places for our food. And we have to use the latest of cabotage and the merchant marine to bring these containers of food to us. There are many ways in which our dignity has been attacked with the wagon, well, not the wagon, the container, the wagon as a metaphor. So I'm going to give that some thought and in the context of the concept of dignity. Somebody talked about cultural genocide, and I want to address that as well. There's a Spanish scholar, I forget his name. I'm not even sure he's from Spain, he may be French, but he has this concept called urbicidio. Urbicidio, because he mainly focuses on cities, but really is, akin to cultural genocide, but only in the sense that it applies to structures. How invading or people who take over empire or whatever, political regimes or whatever, look to destroy or efface structures. So it's a form of state-sponsored vandalism that we're talking about, right? And I think that's a big important piece of the cultural genocide argument that is not being discussed enough. And I want to have mention an example really quick about schools, because schools are my obsessions. Not too long ago, a school had a beautiful mural. You may be familiar with this. La Escuela Julia de Burgos, the public school Julia de Burgos, has a beautiful mural by Martino, right? And these people who bought the school, Julia de Burgos, so these people that bought the school for $1, a church, went over it with white paint, like disappeared it, effaced. To me, that's vandalism. It's cultural vandalism. Not only are they erasing a Julia de Burgos, right? They're erasing the heritage of Martino, who no longer lives. And they're erasing, and I think this is crucial, they are erasing a very important tradition in Puerto Rico, because the mural was about La Semana del Comedor Escolar. One of the most beautiful and important cultural traditions in Puerto Rico was precisely to make art in the places where the children eat. It's kind of feeding them not only with food but also with beauty and with their own culture, right? And I think part of our thinking about cultural genocide has to include that, the structures, the monuments, the art. The beauty.